Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This is the second reading in part 4 of our book, and the question is, what should I do and who should I be? This is the Akaranga Sutra, a Jain text from the Jain religion. I'll read a little bit about that in Richard Bilsker's intro paragraph on page 385. So he says, the Akaranga Sutra contains one of the most succinct versions of the concept of ahimsa, non-violence, in Jain ethics. Jainism and Buddhism, as mentioned in part 1 of 4 fundamental questions, are two of the views that came out of Hinduism as rejections of Buddhism around 2,500 years ago. So that I think there's a mistake there. Jainism and Buddhism, as mentioned in part 1, came out of Hinduism as rejections of, I think, theism around 2,500 years ago. Clearly Buddhism didn't emerge out of Hinduism as a rejection of Buddhism, so I think there's just a typo there. But Jainism and Buddhism were both rejections of, I think maybe he was meaning to say Brahmanism. You know, the Brahmin, the highest caste in the caste system, had become corrupt in many people's opinion, and so there was a rejection of the entire Hindu religion. Buddhism was one instance of that, Jainism is another. So, based on the Akaranga Sutra, you won't be able to tell too much about the religion, but they do believe in a soul or a self, whereas Buddhism does not. The Anatman philosophy of no Atman, whereas the Jains do believe in a soul, but there's no mention of Vishnu, there's no mention of a god, so it seems to be kind of a atheistic and yet believing in individual souls. No supreme soul, but there are individual souls. And the main lesson of this text is extreme nonviolence to different classifications of living beings. And part of this cosmology is that there are fundamental elements that make the universe: earth, water, fire, air, ether. They're considered as concentric spheres of the universe, and each element becomes subtler and subtler. So according to this text, there are, for example, water. It is itself living matter, it says on page 386, and fire. Fire is itself alive. There are living beings whose bodies are made out of fire. So you shouldn't abuse fire because you'll be hurting the fire bodies. You shouldn't abuse water because you'll be abusing the water itself. And similarly with the element of wind. And he's saying if you deny that there are such bodies made of these elements, then it's as much as to deny the existence of the self. For example, up on page 386, a man should not himself deny the world of water bodies, nor should he deny the self. He who denies the world of water bodies denies the self, and he who denies the self denies the world of water bodies. So they do believe in a self that reincarnates from one body to another. The self never disappears. In Buddhism, the goal is the self is an illusion. It's not real. Just like the word chariot is a single word that means something, but what it's referring to isn't a single thing. It's a bunch of parts temporarily, loosely tied together, but really it remains a bunch of different separate parts. That is not the Jain ethic. They do believe in individual souls, but there's no mention of Vishnu or God. And I mention that because that's the discussion question 1. Contrast the view here with the one found in Hinduism. What are the main similarities and differences? So, to answer that question, let me just read through the first paragraph, because what happens is there's a formula that gets repeated for each of the elements: earth, water, fire, wind. They say the same series of words, just replacing, earth will be replaced by water, which will then be replaced by fire. So I'll just read the first paragraph on page 385. So Book 1, Lecture 1, second lesson. The living world is afflicted, miserable, difficult to instruct, and without discrimination. In this world full of pain, suffering by their different acts, see the benighted ones cause great pain. See, there are beings individually embodied in earth, not one all soul. See, there are men who control themselves, whilst others only pretend to be houseless, such as monks whose conduct isn't up to par with the ascetic principles. Because one destroys this earth body by bad and injurious doings, and many other beings besides, which he hurts by means of earth through his doing acts relating to earth. About this, the revered one, who is later called Mahavira at the top of page 386, the revered one has taught the truth. For the sake of the splendor, honor, and glory of this life, for the sake of birth, death, and final liberation, for the removal of pain, man acts sinfully towards earth, or causes others to act so, or allows others to act so. This deprives him of happiness and perfect wisdom. He who injures these earth bodies does not comprehend and renounce the sinful acts. He who does not injure these comprehends and renounces the sinful acts. So, notice it seems a little weird. For the sake of splendor, honor, and glory of this life, I can see how it would not be a worthwhile thing harming living beings for the sake of splendor and honor in this life. But then he goes on to say, for the sake of birth, death, and final liberation, for the removal of pain, man acts sinfully towards earth. So with the goal of liberating your soul from the cycle of reincarnation, still people act sinfully towards earth. So the lesson is similar to the Hindu lesson in the Bhagavad Gita of not being attached to the fruits of your actions. So even though in the Bhagavad Gita Krishna says to Arjuna, you should try to achieve liberation from the cycle of reincarnation, still he also says, don't be attached to the fruits of your actions, just be attached to your duty and ultimately be devoted to me, the Supreme Atman, the Supreme Vishnu. So it seems contradictory. Don't be attached to the fruits of your actions, and yet strive to escape the cycle of reincarnation. But even that is the fruit of your actions. So don't even be worried about liberation. Krishna ultimately says, just serve me and don't worry about the consequences. Just do your duty, and then you'll be happy. And similarly here in the Akaranga Sutra, just don't cause pain to other living beings, even if you think by doing so, but maybe by offering a fire sacrifice or doing some ritual act, if you're causing pain to other living beings, it's not worth it. You won't be happy so long as you're causing pain to other creatures. Then he goes on to say the same basic series of sentences about water in the third lesson and fire in the fourth lesson at the bottom of page 386. He talks about plants in the fifth lesson and animals in the sixth lesson, and then wind in the seventh lesson. And so the goal is don't hurt creatures in any of the elements that you might find. I'll read a little bit here on page 386, the second full paragraph in the middle of the page. He says, there are beings living in water, many lives. Of a truth to the monks, water has been declared to be living matter. See, considering the injuries done to water bodies, those acts which are injurious but must be done before the use of water, straining, for example, have been distinctly declared. So Jains have strict rules about filtering water through cloth to help the microbiotic creatures in there escape, and strict rules about walking through grass so as not to kill little insects. So there's extreme non-violence. Now let's go to discussion question 1 on page 391. Contrast the view here with the one found in Hinduism. What are the main similarities and differences explained? They both believe in a soul. They both believe in reincarnation. They both believe that the goal of life is to control your sense desires, self-control. However, the biggest difference is there's no mention of God in the Akaranga Sutra. There's no mention of controlling your mind by devoting yourself to the Supreme Soul. And also, whereas the Akaranga Sutra is extreme nonviolence, the whole Bhagavad Gita is Krishna convincing Arjuna to slaughter his own kinsman. So it's not that Hinduism praises violence, and it doesn't. It believes in reincarnation. Animals have souls, plants have souls. So if you cause unnecessary suffering to any living being, you'll have the karma. You'll have to keep being born again and dying again, which is painful, the whole process. But it's okay to kill creatures in certain situations, according to Hinduism. And it's not that kind of, it is non-violent to a degree, and then it's very violent in certain situations, even to the point of killing your own kinsman. So I think that covers the basic similarities and differences. It's not surprising that there are a lot of similarities, because Jainism grew out of Hinduism, and it has a lot of the same cosmology, a lot of the same words. But it's also not surprising that there's differences, because it rejected Hinduism and developed a new religion. So discussion question 2 on page 391. What would life be like for someone putting the idea of ahimsa into practice? Explain. Well, it's a pretty broad question. I don't usually include questions that can be so broadly interpreted on an exam, because it's hard for me to grade it. But it would be more difficult, I think, than not putting that extreme form of ahimsa into practice, because, you know, for example, just driving to the store to pick up some, some kind of vegetarian food would itself be incurring karma, because you're running over insects on the way, and when you have to take into account every little thing, which, not that there aren't stories of Hindu saints who did the same exact thing, there are, but it's not considered a general rule. There's one part in the Akaranga Sutra here where they talk about how the Buddhists will object. Here it is in the middle, right after that part about straining the water so as to save the bodies of water lives. And then in parentheses it says, a Buddha will object, we have permission to drink it or to take it for toilet purposes. Thus they destroy by various injuries the water bodies. But in this, their doctrine is of no authority. So Buddhists apparently were rejecting the Jains, some of their rituals of non-violence by saying it's okay to take water and use it for your toilet purposes without straining it and going through all this. And the Jain text here says, and thus you see how violent these Buddhists are. So I'm saying it's extreme nonviolence. I'm not saying that that's wrong. Maybe that's right, but it is more intense than other nonviolent ethics, I would say. So to put that into practice would be an ascetic practice. The final discussion question on page 391. Discussion question 3. This question also is pretty open-ended. Mohandas Gandhi advocated the use of ahimsa as the foundation for his idea of nonviolent civil disobedience. Why might ahimsa be an effective tactic? Explain. So I can't really grade you on that based on your knowledge of this text, because it's just asking you a general question. But when I read this question, it makes me think of Martin Luther King, who adopted a lot of Gandhi's political tactics of nonviolence. Why is it effective? Because it can make your oppressor look evil to the world. It's especially effective in the era of mass communication. If you can get pictures of the British guards beating your people with sticks, or the American police shooting your children with high-powered fire hoses, then you make them look bad, and that can help delegitimize your oppressor and bring your group some kind of relief, is how I would, something along those lines. But I'm not sure if I included these. I'm pretty sure I didn't include discussion question 2 on the exam. Maybe I did include discussion question 3, but if I did, the safest bet is to relate it to the text that the discussion question is attached to. Okay, so that's it for the Akaranga Sutra. The next video will be about the Buddhist text, the beginning of Buddha's preaching.